Hello and welcome to this Tutor to You student webinar, this one looking at social influence with a focus on essay writing. Two things I'd like to look at in today's webinar. Firstly, start by looking at what lessons we can learn from last year's AS examinations by looking at application and short essays. Then in the second half of the webinar, I'd like to look at the three different types of essay questions that could come up in the exam. So your research essay questions, explanation essay questions and application essay questions, and that will become clearer in the second half of today's webinar. So let's start by looking at what lessons we can learn from last year's examination. Okay, on the screen you'll see the average percentage that all of the students scored in the social psychology section of paper 1. Now the average score was 69%, which is actually very good, but there's a few questions I'd like to turn our attention to. Firstly, there is question 1.2, which was a short application question which had an average score of 44%, so we can certainly make some improvements there. Although question 3 was done really badly, that's actually a research method question, so I'm going to cover that in a later webinar. So the other question I'd like to turn our attention to would be the short essay question, which got an average score of 63%. But it's actually quite a straightforward question, so I think we should focus there to see what we can pick up from that question. Let's start with the application question. Now here's the question from the exam. It started with name 3 behaviours that enable a minority to influence a majority. Nearly everyone got that and said the 3 key factors, which was our consistency, our flexibility and our commitment. Okay. The second part of the question says Marcus wants to persuade a group of friends to go travelling in the summer, but the rest of the group wants to go on a beach holiday. Briefly suggest how Marcus might use the 3 behaviours identified in your answer to persuade his friends to go travelling. Now let's take a look at what the examiner said. If we look at the pink bubble on the screen, you'll see that many students typically stated that Marcus should show consistency by being consistent in his point of view. Your teachers will have said this time and time again. You can't use the key term to define the word that you're defining, okay? If we look in the orange bubble, it says that some students offered implausible and probably ineffective suggestions. For example, that Marcus could go on a hunger strike or refuse to speak to his friends. Now your application has to be realistic, and that's clearly not a very realistic answer, so that won't work either. In blue is what we should be doing, so better responses gave a clear and logical suggestion that showed they understood what the 3 terms mean, okay? Now with that in mind, here's how you'd structure a really simple answer to that question, okay? Marcus would need to be stable in his view that going travelling in the summer is better than going on a beach holiday, and remind his friends of this, okay? Notice I've said stable in his view, brackets consistent. I've not defined the key term by using the word consistency, okay? Furthermore, he could show commitment by offering to make all of the travel arrangements and book the tickets. Okay, so I've given a nice plausible suggestion there about how he could be committed. Furthermore, Marcus would need to be prepared to compromise or be flexible. So again, I'm redefining the term with other words. For example, he might say that if his friends go travelling, they could also visit a beach to demonstrate his willingness to compromise. Okay. Nice and simple, didn't need to be that sort of technical, but I've just gone a little bit beyond the extract to show that actually I can think about Marcus as if I was putting myself in his shoes, okay? So that's how you tackle that particular application question. The second question I'd like to look at is this one on the screen now, which is a short essay. It was outline Asch's findings in relation to 2 variables that affect conformity and explain 2 limitations of Asch's conformity research rate marks. So a mini essay, okay? Really important examiner commentary, and I know why students do this. Many students started their response with a detailed and unnecessary description of Asch's original study. I spoke to students following the exam, and many of them said, well, it didn't seem right to talk about the variations unless I talked about the original. Well, the examiner's not asked you to talk about the original, and the examiners will know the study very well, so you don't need to. Although it might feel unnatural to answer this question by just talking about one of the variations, that's what it's asked you to do, okay? So that's the key to this. Now, as always, we want to unpick a question like this because actually, if we use this question to guide our response, it tells you exactly what you need to do, okay? Highlighted in yellow is the first thing that we need to do. So it says findings and 2 variables of conformity. So it just wants the results, okay? If you know the specification that I've just put on the screen in italics for you, you'll see that actually the variables that affect conformity are group size, unanimity and task difficulty. So you're going to be talking about the findings of 2 of those variables, okay? If we think about the second part, it says 2 limitations of Asch's conformity research generally. So limitations could include things like ecological validity, population validity, ethics if you want, doesn't matter. But that's where our response is guided. So really it's 4 marks, 2 marks for each of the 2 variables and 2 marks for each of the 2 limitations. While it's not marked like that, if you approach the question in that way, you won't really go wrong, okay? Now with that in mind, you might say that one variable that affects conformity is group size. I've signposted the answer straight away. Asch found that with just one confederate, conformity dropped to 3%, When it was 2 Confederates, conformity dropped to 12.8, and when it was 3 Confederates, conformity remained the same at 32%. Okay, there's my first variable. A second variable is unanimity. This is the extent to which a majority agree. In one variation, one Confederate gave the correct answer throughout, and conformity dropped to 5%. In another variation, one of the Confederates gave a different incorrect answer, and here conformity dropped to 9%. Okay, just the findings. Wasn't asking for conclusions. If we highlight that just to show where I've really signposted the answer, you'll see that I'm really telling the examiner, look, I've told you about my 2 different variables, and I've given you the results. I've even remembered the percentages. Now, I always get asked this, you don't need the numbers, but it's really, really nice to have them as a sort of way of showing off your knowledge if you get them correct. Moving on from that, we need to talk about 2 limitations. So we might say that one weakness of the Asch experiment is that it lacks ecological validity. In the experiments, they were required to judge line lengths, which is a very artificial task, and everyday examples of conformity don't involve such mundane requests. This matters because we're unable to generalise the results of this experiment to real-life situations of conformity, and don't know why people would conform that way in everyday life. A second weakness is it also lacks population validity. It was 123 male American participants, and that matters because we can't generalise those results to females, non-Americans, and so on. Okay. Again, if I highlight on there, what's really important is I've talked about what the limitations are, and I've said why that matters for this piece of research. Now you can see the entire answer on the screen, really clearly structured, really obvious to the examiner where the marks are going to be, and quite a short, I think it's only 200 words, that response, to pick up all 8 marks. So really, really short, concise response that answers that question really, really well, okay? Moving on to the second part of our webinar, we're going to focus on essays now and shift our attention to essay questions, but sticking within social psychology. Now in psychology there's 3 different types of essay questions that we're going to approach in a minute. But before we do that, it's useful just to make the distinction between what the difference is between a year 1 and a year 2 essay. In year 1, typically a standard essay would be 12 marks, which was 6 marks for knowledge, 6 marks for evaluation. If it was an application variety, it would be 6 marks knowledge, 2 marks application, 4 marks evaluation. You've got, roughly speaking, 12 to 15 minutes to answer that question, which at the sort of normal end would be looking at about 375 words, of which your knowledge comprises 175 words, your evaluation about 200. In year 2, although some of it changes, not everything changes, it will be 16 marks in year 2. But as you see, a standard essay, it's still 6 marks for knowledge, but now 10 marks for evaluation, so the evaluation's increased. If it was an application essay, the number of application marks has gone up, okay, as has the number of evaluation marks. You're therefore, of course, going to have slightly longer to write this. You've got around the 16 to 20 minutes mark, roughly speaking 500 words. But probably most importantly, and the bit I want to draw your attention to, is although the number of knowledge marks has stayed the same, you're looking to write about 175 words for AO1 still. The number of AO3 marks has increased significantly, and therefore the amount of words you're going to be writing for your evaluation likewise increases significantly to about 325-ish words of discussion evaluation. Let's put that into the context of 3 different questions now. So as I've mentioned, you can get research questions, what I call explanation questions, and application questions. Let's put that into conformity so we're sticking within social psychology. Your research question might read, outline and evaluate research examining conformity. Your explanation question might say, discuss explanations, plural, of conformity. And your application question might say, discuss explanations of conformity and refer to person X and Y in your answer, okay? All of those questions could appear in year 1 and year 2 as a 12 or a 16 mark variation. Now, although there's 3 questions, I would argue that there's actually only 2 different structures that you would use to tackle those 2 questions. If it was the research question, outline and evaluate research into conformity, I would argue that you're going to take this approach. You do all of your knowledge first, so in this case you'd outline Asch. You then bring in 3 evaluation points if you're a year 1 student, or you might bring in 3 extended or 2 or 3 extended evaluation points if you're a year 2 student, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. If it is either your explanation or your application question, I would argue that you'd structure it slightly differently. You bring in one of your explanations, first of all. So you might talk about normative social influence, you bring in your evidence, you might talk about Asch, and then you evaluate that evidence. And we'll dive into that one in a bit more detail in a moment. Let's look at structure 1 first so we really get our heads around this. So if it was outline and evaluate research into conformity, let's imagine we're a year 1 student and it was just a 12 marker. We're going to outline Asch, we're going to talk about the aim, the method, the results and the conclusion. We then might use 3 fairly typical evaluation points. It lacks population validity, it lacks ecological validity, and he broke some ethical issues. Okay. Now with that in mind, The difficulty, and this is quite hard, is summarising Asch in about 175 words, which is the same number of words you write in year 1 or year 2. Here's what it could look like, and this is tricky, so I would practice writing these, okay? One study that examined conformity was conducted by Asch in 1956. He examined the extent to which social pressure from a unanimous majority affects conformity in an unambiguous situation. Okay. Asch's sample consisted of 123 male undergraduate students who believed they were taking part in a vision test. Asch used a line judgment task where he placed one real naive participant in a room with 6 to 8 Confederates. In turn, each had to say out loud which line A, B or C was most like the target line in length. Each participant completed 18 trials and the Confederates gave the same incorrect answer on 12 trials, known as critical trials. On average, the real participants conformed to the incorrect answers on 32% of the critical trials. 74% of participants conformed at least once, and 26% never conformed. In a follow-up interview, most of the participants said they knew their answers were incorrect but went along with the group to fit in, which confirms that participants complied due to normative social influence. That's 179 words. Some teachers would argue, and rightly so, that they might advise you to write 1 to 2 studies, 1.5 studies. It's very, very hard in social because there's so much to say about the studies. 1 study in depth, if it just says outline and evaluate research, would be enough, okay? But you could take 1 or 2, it doesn't matter. Let's look at, if we were year 1, what a year 1 style evaluation paragraph might look like for the idea of population validity. Really short, really sweet and simple. One issue with the research is it's been criticised for lacking population validity. He used a biased sample of 123 male students from a college in America, actually a collection of colleges. Therefore, or this matters because we can't generalise the results to other populations, for example female students, and we're unable to conclude if females would have conformed in a similar way. Before we move on, let's do the same for ethical issues. I want to stress these two for a reason. Asch's research is ethically questionable. He broke several ethical guidelines, including deception and protection from harm. He deliberately deceived his participants, saying they were taking part in a vision test and not an experiment on conformity. Therefore, Asch was not treating his participants with integrity and respect, which could have led to emotional distress or harm. Now, there's our structure 1. So we're keeping in mind, we're pretending for now that this is a 12-mark year 1 essay. We've put those 3 evaluation points in. We've outlined Asch. Here's what it would look like as one essay. So 176-ish words of knowledge, 216 words of evaluation, short, sweet, and everything we need. Now, the reason I wanted to show you the 12-mark variation first is because when we get to year 2, as we know, the outline, the number of knowledge marks doesn't increase, but what does increase is the number of evaluation marks. So let's imagine it's now a 16-marker. I would argue a more sort of cost-effective way to approach this is not to include any more evaluation points. So I wouldn't be adding a full 4/5 personally, although you could. I would just extend the evaluation points I've got by adding in an issue in a debate or a counter argument. Okay, so let's see how that might work. If we take the population validity point again, but this time sandwich in some of our year 2 knowledge, an issue and a debate in there. We keep our point and our evidence the same. So we say an issue with Asch's research is it lacks population validity. His sample consisted of 123 male students from America and is therefore biased. We now improve this massively and say, well, Asch assumed that the results of his research would apply to females, which is known as a beta bias. This is where a psychologist minimises the differences between males and females. This can result in a biased view that assumes that men and women are alike when it comes to conformity, and therefore demonstrates an androcentric view of conformity. You will slightly change your explanation at the bottom, but not by much. This matters because we can't generalise the results to females, and we don't know if they would have conformed in a similar way on the basis of Asch's beta-biased research. You can see immediately, by just adding in that issue debate to the population validity point on the left there, we've improved that evaluation point significantly, okay? And therefore we don't need to include more evaluation points, we're just including better ones because we're a year 2 psychology student now. Let's do the same for ethical issues because we can actually approach this in a different way by adding in a counter-argument. So we keep the point and the evidence the same, so his research is ethically questionable and he broke several guidelines, including deception. He deliberately deceived his participants and said they were taking part in a vision test, not an experiment on a conformity. You could counter-argue here and say, well, although it's unethical, his experiment required deception to achieve valid results. If the participants were aware of the true aim, they might have displayed demand characteristics and acted differently. You now need to change your explanation because you need to come to a conclusion. So I would say, well, Asch interviewed all of the participants after the experiment to overcome this issue. And it could be argued that the ends justified the means, as the researchers provided an interesting platform for lots of research into conformity. Again, you can see how we've just improved the depth of that evaluation. To put that into context on screen now, okay, you can see on the left the 12-mark variation, the year 1 version of the essay, which was nearly 400 words, exactly what we're after. The year 2 version of the same essay, which is 537 words, roughly again what we're after. But all that has changed, which is what's highlighted in purple, are those extended Berger evaluation paragraphs, or what we might call double whopper paragraphs now, okay. So we haven't included any more evaluation, we've just included more in-depth, better year 2 style evaluation, I would call it. So I would keep your essays the same, but just try to, where possible, add in counter arguments, issues and debates to really extend the depth of your evaluation. So there's your structure one. If you've got a different question, discuss explanations of conformity, I'm going to argue that you might want to take a different structure, okay, and here's the reason why. I would start in this case, it's explanations with one explanation. I'd talk about normative social influence. I'm then going to bring in evidence this time round. I'm going to bring in Asch. The reason I'm bringing in Asch is to support the idea of normative social influence. Evidence to support the idea of normative social influence. Okay, I stress that's important because you're not using Asch by outlining the A method results conclusion. You're using Asch in a much smaller way in this study, and that's important. That in itself, actually, before I show you the last point, is part of your evaluation in this essay. And students often don't understand this aspect. Okay, the evidence you're bringing in is part of your discussion, okay, because the explanation part is the normative social influence. Your evidence is evidence to support that explanation. So this is already AO3 here, but you're going to go further because you're going to need a bit more to say in this essay. So at that point you can bring in some evaluation and talk about some of the issues with Asch and therefore why those are issues for the idea of normative social influence. And I'll give you an example in a moment. I would do that first, and then I would move on to bring in my second explanation, informational social influence. I would bring in some further evidence by Jennis in this case, which is the jelly bean study, and then I would evaluate Jennis as evidence to support informational social influence. Let's see what that looks like again, okay? So start with our first explanation. So normative social influence is when a person conforms to be accepted and to feel like they belong to a group. Here a person conforms because it's socially rewarding and to avoid social rejection, for example, feeling like they don't fit in. There's your explanation. Bringing in my evidence, look how short it is compared to the description of Asch we just did. Asch's study into conformity provides support for normative social influence. He found that many of the participants went along with the obviously wrong answer of the other group members. When asked by Asch in the post-experimental interviews why they did this, they said that they changed their answer to avoid disapproval from the rest of the group, which clearly shows that normative social influence has occurred as the participants conformed to fit in. Furthermore, Asch demonstrated that when the pressure to conform was removed by asking the participants to write down their answers on a piece of paper and not say them out loud, the conformity rates dropped to 12.5%. This provides further support or evidence for normative social influence because the reduction in public pressure was reduced the rate of conformity. Okay, you don't need the last extra bit. Actually, you could have stopped there just before it says furthermore Asch demonstrated. So actually you've already got evidence by that point. I was just throwing in a second point for you there, okay? What's really key with that description is I've not outlined the A method results conclusion. I've used Asch to say how Asch demonstrates that normative social influence exists. Finally, you move on to critique Asch and say, well actually, is Asch right? So you could say, while the Asch study provides support for the idea of normative social influence, more recent research has yielded very different results. For example, Perrin and Spencer conducted an Asch-style experiment and found a conformity level of 0.25%. Therefore, it could be argued that the results of Asch are actually the result of a different era and don't represent conformity and the idea of normative social influence in 2017. Now, just so you can see what all that looks like on the screen, I've just shifted it the other direction around there. We've got our explanation at the top, which is our knowledge, part of our evaluation, which is our evidence of Asch, and our further evaluation, as it were, which is our criticism of Asch as support, okay? Essentially, you would then repeat that. You do that a second time round. You talk about normative social influence, you bring in evidence from Jennis, and then you would critique Jennis, okay? I'm not going to talk you through the second example, but just so you can see it on screen here. Here is the entire answer on screen for you now. The reason I take this different approach is because it just makes it very, very clear where your knowledge is, where your evidence is, and where your evaluation is, okay? So it's very, very easy to mark an answer like this. There is nothing to stop you structuring it differently, but this is just the structure I would personally recommend for an essay of this nature, okay? What's handy though is if we move on to our third essay type now, which is a application essay, the structure is essentially the same. Now, to give it some context, I've made up a scenario. So Joseph and Kate are two newly qualified teachers who recently joined Christ the King College. Their colleagues are going on a one-day strike due to pay and conditions. When Kate was asked why she went on strike, she said, after sitting in the staff room and hearing the arguments of her colleagues, I realised they were right and the conditions are definitely getting worse for teachers. When Joseph was asked, he said, I just fancied a day off and I didn't want to be the only one sitting in the office alone, so I thought I'd join in everyone else. I'd keep exactly the same structure with one small tweak. You bring in your evidence, your normative social influence. You bring in your explanation, your normative social influence, your AO1. You then bring in your evidence, your Asch. This time round, you don't need your further evaluation. Remember, there's not as many marks for evaluation here. What you do need, though, is your AO2, your application. So I would remove my methodological criticism here and replace it with my application of how Joseph demonstrates normative social influence, okay? I'm just going to shift that up now so you can see the whole thing. I will then do exactly the same. Replace my second bit of further evaluation with more application, in this case, Kate. You don't need any further evaluation here because you won't have the time or the word limit to write it in. So what you're doing is replacing the further evaluation with application for this particular essay. Let's again just see what that looks like on screen. So the explanation stays the same. Normative social influence is when a person conforms to be accepted and feel like they belong to the group. They're doing it because it's socially rewarding to avoid rejection, for example, feeling like they don't fit in. You bring in your evidence, exactly the same as before. Okay, I'll just read you the first part, not the extra bit. Asch's study provides research support for normative social influence. He found that many participants went along with the wrong answer from the other group members. When asked by Asch in the interviews, they said they did this because they wanted to avoid disapproval from the rest of the group, which clearly shows normative social influence had occurred. They conformed to fit in. I'm not going to critique Asch now. I'm going to explain how it applies to, in this case, Joseph. Joseph is demonstrating normative social influence because he's conforming so that he isn't alone and to join in with everyone else. The extract doesn't suggest he believes that the strike is right, which will be informational social influence, and therefore he's conforming to be accepted and belong to the group. Furthermore, he's also demonstrating compliance because he's only changing his public behaviour but not his private beliefs. Okay. Now, with that in mind, again, if we shift that around, you can see that the essay, the purple is exactly the same as before. The orange, the evidence is the same as before. We've lost the green further evaluation, but replaced it with application in this case, okay? But exactly the same structure of essay. Like before, you would do exactly the same. You'd talk about informational social influence, bring in your evidence of Janice, and you'd apply it to Kate. And here's what your entire essay would look like on the screen there, okay? So again, essay structure 2 is the same for explanation essays and application essays. The only difference is that you have to obviously change your application and your further evaluation round depending upon the question type. So there we have it. Just as a quick summary, we've got 3 different types of essay questions that you need to be aware of. What I would call research questions, outline and evaluate research into conformity, explanation, discuss explanations, and application, discuss explanations referring to X and Y in your answer. Just as a very visual quick recap, if it's essay structure 1, you're going to do all of your knowledge first, followed by 3 evaluation paragraphs. And if you're a year 2 student, you're going to extend those evaluation paragraphs further. If it's essay structure 2 for your explanations essay, you're going to bring in your explanation first of all, one of them, bring in your evidence to support that explanation, and then critique that evidence, and then repeat that a second time round, bringing in your second explanation, more evidence, more evaluation. The only thing that changes, as you're about to quickly see, from essay structure 2 to 3 is in essay structure 3, your application, you replace that further evaluation with application. And that's how I would tackle those 3 different essay questions, okay? Now, I really hope you found that useful. That applies to all of your topics in Year 1 and Year 2 psychology. Really, those are the only 3 types of questions that you are gonna see. There may be a few odd types here and there, but these are the 3 main areas that you're going to see. Hope you found that useful. As always, there are plenty more videos on our YouTube channel, so if you just search Tutor2 on YouTube, you'll find lots of videos there. And do subscribe and follow us on Twitter and Facebook for lots more sort of guidance, support and advice. Hope you found that useful. Thank you once again. Bye-bye now.